When a billionaire's daughter is abandoned on a frozen mountain as punishment, she expects to break within days. What she doesn't expect is the single father who refuses to save her because survival isn't given, it's earned. This is the story of two people stripped to nothing, one learning that money can't buy respect, and one discovering that sacrifice doesn't have to mean loneliness. Before we begin, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. Now, let me take you to a mountain where winter doesn't forgive, and neither does the truth. The cold came first, not the picturesque kind that belonged on holiday cards or ski resort brochures. This was the bone-deep, knuckle-splitting cold that turned breath into ice and made every movement feel like punishment. It rolled down from the peaks in invisible waves, seeping through wood grain and window cracks, settling into the marrow of everything it touched. Ethan Cole had stopped noticing it weeks ago. His hands moved with mechanical precision, wrapping worn insulation around exposed copper piping beneath the cabin's kitchen sink. The flashlight clamped between his teeth threw harsh shadows across the cramped crawl space. Outside, the January wind hammered against the walls with the persistence of a bill collector, but Ethan barely registered it anymore. Cold was just another variable now, like the failing well pump or the generator that coughed black smoke every third start, just another problem on a list that never got shorter. He twisted the final section of pipe wrap into place and backed out from under the sink, his shoulders protesting the confined angle. The cabin's interior looked worse in the afternoon light, exposed beams where the ceiling sagged, water stains blooming across the far wall like rust-colored flowers, gaps in the floorboards wide enough to lose a coin through. The restoration job was supposed to take 6 weeks. He was entering month 4. Ethan stood, joints popping, and walked to the window. The view should have been stunning, ridge after ridge of snow-covered peaks stretching toward a sky the color of old bruises. But all he saw was isolation, miles of it, the kind of distance that turned a 30-minute drive into a 2-hour ordeal when the weather turned, which it always did. His phone sat on the makeshift workbench, screen dark. No service this high up? Not reliably. He'd have to drive down to Miller's Gap just to check messages, to hear his son's voice crackling through a bad connection, to explain again why Daddy couldn't come home yet, why the job was taking so long, why everything was always complicated. Ryan was 7 now, 7 years old and already learning that fathers disappeared when money got tight. The thought sat in Ethan's chest like a stone. He pushed away from the window and grabbed his coat, a heavy canvas work jacket with frayed cuffs and a broken zipper that he'd repaired 3 times with wire. The well pump had been making a grinding noise that morning, the kind that meant bearings were about to go. If it died completely, the cabin would be uninhabitable within days. No water meant no work, and no work meant no paycheck, and no paycheck meant... The sound of tires on gravel cut through his spiral. Ethan froze, one arm halfway into his coat sleeve. Visitors didn't come up here. The road was barely maintained, a rutted dirt track that turned into a skating rink every time the temperature dropped. The delivery drivers refused to climb this high after November, and the previous owner had been dead for 18 months. Nobody had business on this ridge except... Through the window, he watched a black SUV slide into view. Not a truck. Not a contractor's van with logos and ladder racks. A luxury SUV, the kind with chrome accents and paint that probably cost more per gallon than Ethan made in a week. It moved slowly up the final stretch of driveway, tires crunching over frozen gravel, completely out of place against the backdrop of weathered wood and snowdrifts. Ethan's hand drifted toward the pry bar leaning against the wall. Not a weapon, just a tool, but heavy enough to matter if things went wrong. Repo men didn't usually drive vehicles that nice, and the property owner's lawyer had been clear that Ethan was alone up here, completely isolated from... The SUV stopped 20 feet from the cabin's front steps. The engine cut off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the wind and the ticking of cooling metal and Ethan's own breath fogging the window glass. Then the driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. She was completely wrong for this place. That was Ethan's first thought, watching her emerge into the frozen afternoon like someone who'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a corporate retreat. Mid-20s, maybe 30, wearing a wool coat that probably had a designer label stitched inside and boots that had never seen actual mud. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that looked effortless, but probably took 20 minutes to achieve, and even from this distance, Ethan could read the tension in her shoulders, the way she surveyed the cabin like it was a problem she was supposed to solve. She didn't look lost. She looked angry. The woman moved to the back of the SUV and popped the hatch. She pulled out a duffel bag, leather, expensive, completely impractical, and dropped it onto the gravel with the kind of carelessness that said money wasn't real to her, just an abstraction that solved problems without ever running out. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew this type, knew them from construction sites where rich owners showed up to micromanage details they didn't understand, knew them from the brief year he'd tried working corporate before the walls closed in, and he'd fled back to jobs where his hands actually built something real. This woman had the same energy, the assumption that her presence mattered more than his time, that whatever brought her up here automatically took priority. He watched her slam the SUV's hatch and turn toward the cabin, shoulders squared like she was walking into a negotiation instead of 3,000 feet of elevation and a storm forecast that promised to dump another 8 inches overnight. Ethan grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit like a fist. 18 degrees according to the thermometer that morning, but the wind made it feel like single digits, cutting through layers and finding every gap in fabric. The woman stopped halfway to the porch steps, and for just a second, Ethan saw her mask crack. A flinch, a hitch in her breath, the involuntary tightening of someone realizing they'd miscalculated badly. Then she recovered, and the smooth corporate face returned. "Ethan Cole?" Her voice carried across the distance, controlled but with an edge he couldn't quite place. Not fear. Something sharper. "I'm Lena Hawthorne. I believe we need to have a conversation." "About what?" Ethan stayed on the porch, hands in his pockets. Not welcoming, not hostile, just present, waiting. Lena's jaw tightened. She glanced back at the SUV, then at the cabin, then at the miles of empty ridge stretching in every direction. When she looked at him again, something had shifted in her expression, a resignation that looked like it cost her. "About the fact that my family just dumped me here to learn a lesson about humility," she said, each word clipped and precise. "And apparently you're the lucky bastard who gets to babysit me for the next 2 months." Silence. Ethan stared at her. The wind screamed between them, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Somewhere downslope, a branch cracked under the weight of accumulated snow, the sound echoing across the valley like a gunshot. "Say that again," he said slowly. Lena dropped the duffel bag and crossed her arms, and suddenly she looked less like a corporate princess and more like someone barely holding on to the last shred of composure. "You heard me. My father, Douglas Hawthorne, if that means anything to you, decided I needed an attitude adjustment, so he had his lawyers arrange for me to stay here in this charming disaster zone under your supervision until I've sufficiently reflected on my entitled behavior." She gestured at the cabin with one gloved hand, a brittle smile crossing her face. "Congratulations! You're apparently running a reform camp for disappointing daughters, and nobody bothered to tell you until now." Ethan processed this. Douglas Hawthorne. The name rang a distant bell, something about real estate development or venture capital, the kind of money that moved in circles so far above Ethan's world they might as well be different species. Which meant this woman, standing in front of his worksite with anger radiating off her like heat, came from the kind of wealth that treated people like him as furniture. "Nobody told me anything," he said flatly. "Of course they didn't." Lena's laugh had edges. "Why would they? You're just the help. I'm just the problem child. Put us together in the middle of nowhere and see what happens. It's very efficient, really. Very Hawthorne." She picked up the duffel and took another step forward, but Ethan raised one hand. "Stop." Lena froze. Ethan came down the porch steps slowly, boots crunching on frozen ground. He stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the exhaustion beneath her anger, the way her hands shook slightly despite the expensive gloves. Up close, she looked younger than he'd first thought, and more brittle, like someone who'd been running on pride and caffeine for too long. "I don't know what arrangement your family thinks they made," he said quietly, "but this isn't a bed and breakfast. This isn't a retreat. This is a construction site on a mountain that kills people who don't respect it." The well pump is dying, the generator's unreliable, and there's a storm coming that's going to drop the temperature below zero. I'm here because I have a job to finish. That's it. Lena met his eyes. I didn't ask to be here. I know, but here you are. Ethan glanced at the SUV. That thing won't make it back down the mountain if the storm hits early, which means you've got maybe an hour to decide if you're staying or going, because once the snow starts, you're stuck until it clears. I don't have anywhere else to go. The admission came out hard and bitter. They made sure of that. Froze my accounts, cut off my cards, told everyone in my circle that I was taking time to reassess my priorities. This cabin is all I've got until I play along with their little redemption arc. Then you need to understand something. Ethan's voice stayed level, but there was iron underneath. This mountain doesn't care who your father is. The cold doesn't care about your family name. If you stay, you follow my rules, you do the work, and you don't create problems. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a life coach. I fix buildings. That's all. Lena stared at him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the calculations running behind her eyes, measuring him, assessing whether he was serious, trying to find the angle she could use to regain control. She wouldn't find one, because Ethan didn't want anything from her except to be left alone to finish his job. Finally, she nodded, once. Sharp. Fine. Where do I put my things? Ethan turned and headed back toward the cabin. There's a room on the north side. No heat yet, but it's got a door and a window that mostly closes. You'll need extra blankets. I've got 2 spares in the storage closet. He didn't look back to see if she followed. Either she would or she wouldn't. Either way, the well pump still needed fixing before dark, and the sky was already starting to spit snow. Behind him, he heard the scrape of the duffel being dragged across gravel, and then her footsteps on the porch stairs. The cabin's interior made Lena stop in her tracks. Ethan registered her reaction from the corner of his eye while he stripped off his coat, the way her expression shifted from controlled composure to something closer to shock. He'd stopped seeing the space through fresh eyes weeks ago, but watching her take it in reminded him just how rough things actually were. Exposed 2x4s where walls should be. Plastic sheeting stapled over gaps in the exterior. A work table covered in tools and blueprints and coffee mugs that had never quite made it to the sink. The floor was plywood subflooring, unfinished and stained with drop cloths bunched in corners and extension cords snaking everywhere like orange veins. What passed for a kitchen was a camp stove on a makeshift counter, a mini fridge that hummed like it had asthma, and a plastic basin for washing dishes. The sink he'd been working on earlier was functional but ugly, surrounded by exposed pipes and shut-off valves. This is it? Lena's voice had gone quiet. This is the whole cabin? For now. Ethan hung his coat on a peg. When I'm done, it'll be a 3-bedroom with a full kitchen and a deck. Right now it's framework and optimism. Where do you sleep? He pointed to a corner where a sleeping bag was rolled up next to a Coleman lantern and a stack of paperback books. There. You get the room because it's got a door and you're technically a guest, even if neither of us wants you here. Lena set down her duffel. There's no bathroom. Outhouse is around back. There's a chemical toilet inside for emergencies, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you're desperate. Ethan moved to the workbench and started sorting through pipe fittings, giving her space to process. Running water's iffy right now because of the pump situation. I've got 5-gallon jugs for drinking and cooking, and I heat wash water on the camp stove. You've been living like this for months? 3.5. He didn't look up. The owner's estate hired me to restore the place after the previous contractor walked off the job. Pays decent, and I needed the isolation. Why? The question was direct enough that Ethan paused. He could feel her watching him, trying to piece together who he was and why someone would choose this kind of hardship voluntarily. He didn't owe her an explanation, but something in her voice, the genuine confusion, made him answer anyway. I've got a son, he said. 7 years old, lives with his mother down in Ridgemont. I take jobs like this because they pay enough for me to send money home and save up for a better situation. Being up here means I'm not spending what I earn on rent and distractions. It's simple math. Lena was quiet for a moment. You left your son to live in this. I left my son to build a future where I can actually provide for him. Ethan's hands tightened on the wrench he was holding. There's a difference. Is there? He turned to look at her then, and whatever she saw in his face made her take a step back. Yeah, he said quietly. There is. Because in 6 weeks, when this job's done, I'll have enough saved to put a down payment on a real place. Somewhere stable. Somewhere he can visit without his mother worrying I'm going to drop him off at another temporary situation. He set the wrench down carefully. I made choices. Bad ones. I'm fixing them. That's how responsibility works. Lena's throat worked. I wasn't trying to... I know. Ethan cut her off, not unkindly. You were testing boundaries, seeing if I'd react. I'm telling you now you'll get honesty from me, but you won't get apologies for doing what's necessary. He grabbed a flashlight and a tool belt. Your room's the second door on the left. Get settled. I need to check the well before the light goes. If you're hungry, there's canned soup and bread in the cooler. Heat water on the stove if you want something warm. Where are you going? To make sure we have running water tomorrow. He paused at the door. Do yourself a favor. Don't wander off. The woods around here aren't friendly, and I don't have time to search for someone who got lost because they thought a walk would clear their head. Then he was gone, leaving Lena alone in the shell of a cabin with nothing but the wind and her own thoughts for company. Deep. The well house was a squat concrete structure 50 yards downslope from the cabin, half buried in snow and surrounded by pine trees that creaked in the wind like old bones. Ethan had to dig out the door before he could get inside, his breath coming in hard clouds while his fingers went numb despite the work gloves. Inside, the well pump chugged and rattled like it was trying to shake itself apart. He knelt beside the pressure tank and pressed his ear against the cold metal, listening to the grinding that had been getting worse for days. The bearing was shot. He'd known it since Tuesday, but replacing it meant shutting down the water system completely, and he'd been putting it off because the temperature kept dropping and frozen pipes would turn a day job into a week-long disaster. Now he didn't have a choice. Not with someone else in the cabin, someone who didn't understand how precarious everything was up here. Ethan pulled out his phone and checked the time. 3:30. Maybe 2 hours of decent light left, and the snow was starting to fall harder, fat flakes that stuck to everything they touched. The bearing replacement would take 90 minutes if everything went perfectly, which it never did, and working in the dark with frozen fingers was a good way to strip bolts or cross-thread connections or make any of 100 mistakes that would cascade into catastrophe. But if he didn't fix it now, it would fail overnight, and then he'd be doing the same job in worse conditions with an angry woman demanding answers he didn't have. He made his decision in 5 seconds. The tool bag was back in the cabin. He'd need the pipe wrench, the strap wrench, the bearing puller, plumber's tape, and the spare bearing he'd bought 3 weeks ago when he'd first heard the grinding start. And towels, lots of towels, because shutting down the pump meant draining the system, and draining the system meant water everywhere. Ethan stood and headed back up the slope, his mind already running through the steps. Shut off the main valve, bleed the pressure, disconnect the motor housing, extract the old bearing, clean the shaft, install the new bearing, reassemble, pressurize, test. Simple on paper, brutal in practice. When he pushed through the cabin door, Lena was sitting on the floor of the empty room he'd pointed her to, still wearing her coat, staring at the bare walls like they held answers she couldn't quite reach. She looked up when he entered. There's no furniture. Nope. Ethan moved past her toward the workbench. Where am I supposed to sleep? Sleeping bag's in the hall closet. Extra one. It's rated for 20 below, so you'll be fine as long as you keep the door shut to hold heat. On the floor. On the floor. He started loading tools into a canvas bag. There's a foam pad in there too. Not comfortable, but better than plywood. Lena stood slowly. You really meant it. This isn't a retreat. This is just nothing. It's a job site. Ethan paused, tool bag half packed. Look, I get that this isn't what you expected. I get that your family probably sold this as some kind of character-building wilderness experience with rustic charm and life lessons. But the reality is a lot colder and a lot harder than whatever story they told. If you can't handle that, there's still time to call them and negotiate something else. I told you, I don't have anywhere else to go. Then you're going to have to adapt. He went back to packing. Because this mountain doesn't pause for learning curves. What are you doing right now? She moved closer, watching him work. With the tools? Fixing the well pump before it fails completely. How long will that take? Hour and a half if I'm lucky. 3 hours if something breaks. In the dark? Hopefully before the dark, but probably during it, yeah. Ethan cinched the tool bag closed. Why? Lena hesitated, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the corporate mask slipped completely. She looked young and out of her depth and scared in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Because I don't know how any of this works. I don't know what a well pump is or why it matters or what happens if you can't fix it, and I don't like not knowing. Ethan studied her. A well pump brings water up from underground. Without it, we have no running water for drinking, cooking, washing, or toilets. The pump's failing because a bearing is worn out. If I don't replace it now, it'll seize completely, and then we're hauling water by hand from the creek until I can get a replacement part shipped up here, which could take a week in this weather. So it's critical. It's critical. Can I help? The question surprised him. Ethan had expected resistance, complaints, demands to know why this wasn't someone else's problem. But Lena was watching him with something that looked like genuine curiosity, her hands shoved deep in her coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold that seeped through every gap in the walls. You know anything about plumbing? He asked. No? You good with tools? I can hold things. Follow instructions. Ethan considered. An extra pair of hands would speed things up, and if she was serious about learning, it might buy him some peace later when other things inevitably broke. But teaching always took longer than working alone, and his patience for rich kids who thought manual labor was a novelty had worn thin years ago. Still, she'd asked. That counted for something. All right, he said, but you listen. You don't touch anything I don't tell you to touch, and if you complain about the cold or the wet or how hard it is, I send you back here and finish alone. Clear? Clear? Get changed into something you don't mind destroying. We'll be kneeling in mud and water for the next 2 hours. 20 minutes later, they were in the well house and Lena was learning what real work felt like. Ethan had shut off the main valve and opened the bleed ports, and now water was gushing out of the system in cold, rust-stained torrents that soaked through every towel he'd brought and kept going. Lena knelt beside him in jeans and a sweatshirt that had probably cost $200 that morning and would be trash by nightfall, holding a bucket under one of the ports while water hammered into it with enough force to splash her face and arms. Don't let it overflow, Ethan said, working on a stubborn bolt with the pipe wrench. When it's 3/4 full, dump it outside and come back. Lena nodded, teeth chattering, and kept holding the bucket. The bolt came free with a screech of metal on metal. Ethan moved to the next one, his fingers already numb despite the gloves. The temperature in the well house was maybe 30 degrees, warmer than outside, but not by much, and the concrete walls sucked heat out of everything they touched. How do you know which parts to take apart? Lena asked, dumping the full bucket and returning with it empty. Experience. Diagrams. Lot of trial and error when I was younger. Ethan grunted as another bolt fought him. Plumbing's all logic. Water wants to flow downhill and take the path of least resistance. You just have to understand the system well enough to predict what'll happen when you change something. Is that what you do? Change things? I fix things. The bolt finally surrendered. Buildings mostly, sometimes equipment. Whatever needs doing. Lena was quiet while he worked the motor housing free from the pump body, exposing the shaft and the bearing assembly. The old bearing was black with wear, metal ground down until it barely resembled its original shape. Ethan showed it to her. See that? That's what happens when something runs past its limits. The friction builds until the metal actually deforms. If I'd waited another week, the shaft would have seized completely and we'd be replacing the whole motor. How much would that cost? More than I get paid in a month. Lena stared at the ruined bearing. So you're always operating right on the edge. Up here? Yeah, everything's marginal. That's why you don't waste resources and you don't take shortcuts. He set the old bearing aside and reached for the new one. Hold this. She took the new bearing, careful not to drop it, while Ethan cleaned the shaft with a wire brush and solvent. The work was methodical, precise, requiring total attention despite the cramped space and the cold and the water still dripping from overhead pipes. Why'd you take this job? Lena asked after a while. If it's this hard, why not work somewhere easier? Ethan fitted the new bearing onto the shaft, checking alignment. Because easy jobs don't pay enough, and because most contractors won't touch a restoration this far out. Too much risk, too much isolation, too many ways for things to go wrong. He tested the bearing's movement, smooth, no grinding, and nodded. But I'm good at being alone, and I needed time to think about who I want to be for my son. Have you figured it out? Figured out what? Who you want to be. Ethan paused, hands still on the bearing assembly. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the wellhouse walls with a sound like sand on glass. Night was coming fast, and they were only halfway through the repair. I want to be the guy who keeps his promises, he said finally, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He went back to work, tightening bolts in sequence, checking torque by feel. That's all I've got. But Lena didn't respond, but when he glanced at her, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between respect and envy, like she'd just seen something she didn't have and couldn't buy. They worked in silence after that, Ethan reassembling the pump while Lena held parts and passed tools and soaked up knowledge she'd never thought she'd need. By the time they got the system sealed and pressurized, it was full dark outside, and both of them were shaking from cold and exhaustion. Ethan flipped the power switch. The pump hummed to life, smooth, steady, no grinding, and water began flowing through the pipes with the sound of something essential restored. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. We're good? We're good. Ethan started packing tools. For now. They trudged back to the cabin through 6 inches of fresh snow, their breath fogging in the beam of Ethan's headlamp. Inside, he got the camp stove going and heated water for instant coffee, while Lena peeled off her soaked sweatshirt and stood shivering by the propane heater in a thermal undershirt that was probably designer but worked just fine. That was the worst thing I've ever done, she said, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug he handed her. You did fine. I'm serious, I hated every second. But you kept working. Lena looked at him. What choice did I have? You always have a choice. Ethan sipped his own coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. You could have quit and gone back to the cabin. You could have complained until I sent you away. You could have done the bare minimum and made me regret asking for help. He set the mug down. You didn't. That says something. It says I'm stubborn. It says you're stronger than you think. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment something shifted. The beginning of understanding maybe, or just exhaustion breaking down walls neither of them had meant to build so high. Then Lena's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket and stared at the screen, her expression hardening. Service must have come back. What is it? My father's assistant, confirming that I'm settling in and reminding me that I have 60 days to complete my personal development experience before they'll consider reinstating my access to company resources. She read the message again, her jaw tight. They sent an inspector. He'll be here Monday to verify I'm actually staying at the cabin and not hiding out in some hotel. Ethan felt something cold settle in his gut. An inspector. Family lawyer probably, just to make sure I'm suffering appropriately. Tell them not to come. I can't. It's part of the arrangement. Then tell them it's a construction site and they need proper clearance and liability waivers. Ethan's voice had gone hard. This isn't a zoo. I'm not putting on a show for some corporate drone who wants to take photos and write reports. Lena looked at him, surprised. You don't have to deal with him. I'll handle it. If he's coming to my job site, I'll handle it. Ethan stood and moved to the window, staring out at the darkness and the snow that was still falling. I don't care what kind of lesson your family thinks they're teaching you. This place isn't a tool for their power plays. People work here. People could get hurt here. If someone shows up who doesn't understand that, they don't get past the driveway. Silence. Then quietly, thank you. Ethan didn't turn around. Don't thank me. Just understand that while you're here, you're not a Hawthorne. You're not a project. You're just Lena, and you do the work or you don't. Everything else is noise. He heard her move toward the hallway, pausing in the doorway. Ethan? Yeah? Earlier, you said I'm stronger than I think. What made you say that? He thought about the question, about her kneeling in freezing water for 2 hours without complaint, about the way she'd held that bucket steady even when her hands were shaking, about the fact that she'd asked to help in the first place when most people in her position would have stayed inside and demanded service. Because weak people make excuses, he said. You just made coffee, and kept going. When he finally turned around, she was gone, and he was alone with the wind and the work and the knowledge that everything had just gotten a lot more complicated. Outside, the storm buried the mountain under another foot of white, and somewhere down in Ridgemont, his son was probably asking his mother when Daddy was coming home. Soon, Ethan thought, just a little bit longer. He just had to survive the lesson he'd accidentally agreed to teach. Part 2. Louis viết 6,600 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document The Run 45, Part 2. The weekend passed in a rhythm of work and silence. Ethan rose before dawn both days, his internal clock tuned to the thin gray light that came before sunrise. He'd make coffee on the camp stove, check the generator and the well pump, then lose himself in the kind of labor that didn't require thought, framing walls, running electrical conduit, patching gaps in the exterior where wind sliced through like cold knives. Lena emerged later, always bundled in layers, always watching him with an intensity that made him wonder what she was really looking at. She didn't ask to help again, but she didn't hide either. Saturday afternoon, he found her outside with a snow shovel, clearing the path from the cabin to the well house without being asked. The work was clumsy. She held the shovel wrong, put her back into it instead of using her legs, stopped every few minutes to catch her breath in air so cold it burned. But she kept going, and by the time the sun dropped behind the western peaks, the path was clear. Sunday, she appeared in the doorway while he was installing insulation in the north wall, her arms full of his dirty laundry. "Where's the washer?" she asked. Ethan looked up from the fiberglass batting. "Don't have one." "Then how do you—" She stopped. "You don't." "I drive down to Miller's Gap once a week and use the laundromat." He went back to cutting insulation to size. "Next trip's Thursday." Lena stared at the clothes in her arms. "That's disgusting." "That's reality." He fitted a section of insulation between studs and stapled it in place. "You get used to it." She disappeared without another word. 20 minutes later, he heard water running in the kitchen basin and looked over to see her scrubbing his work shirts by hand with a bar of soap, her expensive rings sitting in a neat line on the counter. The sight was so incongruous, this woman who'd probably never washed her own clothes in her life, standing over a plastic tub like a character from another century, that Ethan almost laughed. Instead, he went back to work and pretended not to notice when she hung the shirts on a makeshift line by the propane heater, her hands red from the cold water. That night, they ate canned chili in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the space with their bowls and their thoughts. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the darkness, a tree branch snapped under the weight of ice, the crack echoing across the valley like a warning. "The inspector's coming at 10, Lena said finally, scraping the bottom of her bowl. "His name is Marcus Venn. He works for my father's legal team." Ethan didn't look up from his food. What's he supposed to verify? That I'm here, that I'm staying, that I'm not gaming the system. Her voice went flat. "My father doesn't trust me to suffer appropriately without supervision." "You talk about your family like they're strangers." "Maybe they are." She set her bowl aside. "I don't know anymore. 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood how everything worked. Now I'm sitting in a freezing cabin eating beans from a can while some lawyer comes to check if I've learned to be grateful yet." Ethan finally met her eyes. "Have you?" "Grateful?" Lena laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. "No, but I'm learning other things, like how much I didn't know, like how easy it is to be useless when you've never had to be anything else." "You're not useless. I washed your shirts because I didn't know what else to do with myself. That's not competence, Ethan. That's desperation." He studied her across the dim space, this woman who'd arrived 3 days ago, radiating anger and pride, now sitting in borrowed thermal clothes with her hair in a messy bun and her hands still chapped from the wash water. Something had cracked in her, not broken, but cracked, letting light through gaps that hadn't been there before. "You want to know what I think?" he said. "Probably not." I think you're so used to measuring yourself by other people's standards that you don't know how to see your own progress." Ethan stood and gathered the bowls. "You've been here 3 days. You haven't complained, you haven't demanded special treatment, and you helped fix a well pump in below freezing temperatures without being forced. That's not desperation. That's adaptation." Lena was quiet while he washed the dishes in heated water, and when he turned back around, she was staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. "My father would say I'm playing at being humble," she said softly. "He'd say I'm performing for your benefit so I can go back and tell everyone how hard I tried." "Your father's not here." Ethan dried the bowls and stacked them. "And I don't care about your performance. I care about whether you do the work or make excuses. So far, you're doing the work. Does that matter?" "It's the only thing that matters." The words settled between them like something tangible, and Lena nodded slowly, absorbing them. Outside, the wind shifted direction, driving snow against the windows with renewed fury, and Ethan wondered if the inspector would even make it up the mountain tomorrow, or if the storm would buy them a few more days before the outside world intruded again. He should have known better than to hope for delays. Monday morning arrived clear and brutally cold, the kind of January day where the sun came up bright and useless, lighting everything without warming anything. Ethan was replacing a section of rotten subflooring when he heard the vehicle, not Lena's luxury SUV, but something heavier, a truck engine grinding up the grade in low gear. He set down his circular saw and moved to the window. A black Ford F-250 crested the final rise, pristine despite the mud and slush, corporate logos on the doors too small to read from this distance. It parked next to Lena's SUV with the precision of someone who spent a lot of time arriving at places where their presence was a statement. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Marcus Venn looked exactly like Ethan expected. Mid-40s, expensive outdoor wear that had never seen actual outdoor use. The kind of beard that was professionally maintained to look rugged without being uncivilized. He surveyed the cabin with the expression of someone mentally cataloging deficiencies for a report, then pulled out a tablet and started taking photos. Ethan was out the door before the man could knock. "This is private property," he said from the porch. "State your business." Marcus looked up from his tablet, eyebrows raising slightly. "Ethan Cole, I presume." "Marcus Venn, representing Hawthorne Consolidated Holdings. I'm here to conduct a welfare check on Ms. Lena Hawthorne as stipulated in her conditional residency agreement." "She's fine. Welfare checked. You can leave." "Yupke?" Marcus smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere important. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The agreement requires an in-person verification and documentation of living conditions. Standard protocol for this type of arrangement. There's nothing standard about dumping your boss's daughter on a construction site and calling it character development. Nonetheless, buts." Marcus moved toward the porch steps. "If you'll excuse me," Ethan came down the stairs and stopped 3 feet from the lawyer, close enough that the man had to look up to maintain eye contact. "Let's be very clear about something. This is an active construction site. OSHA regulations apply. You don't have proper safety equipment. You haven't been briefed on site hazards, and you sure as hell haven't signed a liability waiver, which means you don't get to walk around taking pictures and writing reports like you own the place." Marcus's smile tightened. "Mr. Cole, I understand you're protective of your workspace, but I have legal authority. You have legal authority to verify Ms. Hawthorne is alive and present. You don't have authority to inspect my work or interfere with my job. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to wait right here. I'm going to get Lena. She's going to confirm she's alive and staying voluntarily, and then you're going to leave before you step in something that costs your client money." The two men stared at each other, and Ethan could see Marcus recalculating, trying to decide if pushing the issue was worth the confrontation. Before he could answer, the cabin door opened and Lena stepped out. She'd changed into clean clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that was probably Ethan's based on how it hung on her frame, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Without makeup, without the armor of corporate style, she looked younger and harder at the same time, like someone who'd been stripped down to essentials and was still figuring out what was left. "Hello, Marcus," she said evenly. "You can tell my father I'm alive, I'm staying, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Marcus's professional mask slipped for just a second. Lena, you look different? She came down the steps and stood next to Ethan, and he caught the deliberate choice in it. Solidarity, maybe, or just refusing to be isolated. I've been working. Turns out it changes a person. Your father asked me to verify the accommodations are adequate. They're adequate. The reports suggest this facility lacks basic amenities. The reports are correct. Lena's voice stayed calm, but Ethan heard steel underneath. No central heating, no running water in the bathrooms, no internet or reliable cell service. It's exactly as uncomfortable as it's supposed to be. Marcus tapped something on his tablet. And Mr. Cole has been cooperative? Mr. Cole has been professional, which is more than I can say for the family that exiled me here without warning. She crossed her arms. Was there anything else? Because, unlike you, I actually have work to do today. The lawyer's jaw tightened. Your father also asked me to remind you that the terms of your reinstatement require demonstrated personal growth and acceptance of responsibility for past behaviors. He hopes this experience is providing appropriate perspective. Tell my father that perspective is subjective, but frostbite is objective, and I'm learning to prioritize accordingly. Marcus stared at her like she'd grown a second head. I'll include that in my report. You do that. Lena turned back toward the cabin, then paused. Oh, and Marcus? The next time someone comes up here to verify I'm suffering correctly, make sure they understand this is a construction site, not a corporate campus. Mr. Cole was being polite when he mentioned liability waivers. I won't be. She disappeared back inside, leaving Ethan and Marcus standing in the cold morning air. The lawyer cleared his throat. She seems different. She seems tired of being treated like a problem instead of a person, Ethan said. Your inspection's done. Time to leave. Marcus took a few more photos of the cabin's exterior, for the report, presumably, then climbed back into his pristine truck. The engine roared to life, and he executed a careful three-point turn before heading back down the mountain, leaving twin tracks in the snow. Ethan watched until the truck disappeared around the first bend, then went back inside. Lena was standing by the window, arms still crossed, staring at nothing. You all right? He asked. That man has been to my apartment, to my office, to family dinners where he sits 3 seats down and takes notes on everything we say. Her voice was quiet. He's seen me in board meetings and charity galas and every version of myself I've built over 26 years. And just now, I don't think he recognized me at all. Is that good or bad? She turned to look at him. I don't know yet. Ethan grabbed his work gloves from the bench. Well, while you're figuring it out, I need help moving lumber from the truck bed to the north wall. Storm's coming Wednesday, and I want the exterior sealed before it hits. You're putting me to work right after I got inspected for compliance? I'm putting you to work because there's work to do. He headed for the door, then stopped. And because standing around thinking about what your father's lawyer saw or didn't see won't change anything. But building a wall will keep us warmer. Your choice, which one matters more. He left her there and walked out into the cold, trusting she'd follow or she wouldn't. 30 seconds later, he heard her boots on the porch steps. The lumber was 2x6s, 12 feet long, still damp from being stored outside under tarps. They were heavy and awkward, especially in the cold when fingers didn't want to grip properly and breath came in hard clouds. Ethan showed Lena how to carry them, one person on each end, knees bent, back straight, moving in sync to avoid dropping the board or smashing fingers. They made 15 trips from the truck to the staging area inside the cabin, and by the 8th trip, Lena had stopped trying to talk and just focused on breathing and lifting and not falling on the icy ground. Her face went red from exertion, and her hands shook when they set down each board, but she didn't quit. On the last trip, she slipped on a patch of ice. Ethan caught her elbow before she went down, steadying her while the lumber clattered onto the ground between them. She stood there breathing hard, one hand gripping his arm, the other pressed against her ribs. You good? He asked. I'm fine. But she didn't let go right away. Just wasn't expecting it. Ice doesn't warn you. That's why you step carefully every single time, even when you think you know the path. She met his eyes, and he realized she was hearing something beyond the literal advice, some metaphor about her whole situation maybe, about how confidence made you careless and carelessness got you hurt. He hadn't meant it that way, but watching her process it, he didn't correct the interpretation. They picked up the dropped lumber and carried it inside together. By noon, they'd framed out the new wall section, and Ethan was showing Lena how to use a drill to drive screws through the plates into the studs. The work required attention. Line up the screw, apply steady pressure, don't strip the head. And Lena approached it with the same intensity she'd brought to the well pump repair, like she was solving a puzzle where the wrong move had consequences. "Why do you do it this way?" she asked after the fifth screw. "Instead of nails?" "Screws hold better. You can remove them if you make a mistake. And they don't pop out when the wood shifts." Ethan guided her hand to the next mark. "Everything up here shifts. Temperature swings, settling, wind stress. If you build assuming everything will stay perfect, you'll spend all your time fixing failures. So you build expecting problems. I build expecting reality." He stepped back and let her work independently. "Problems are just reality you didn't plan for." Lena sank the next 3 screws without help, and Ethan caught the small smile that crossed her face when the last one seated perfectly flush. It was the kind of satisfaction that came from doing something right with your own hands, and he recognized it because he'd felt it himself 1,000 times. That moment when the work stopped being struggle and became competence. They broke for lunch around 1. Eating sandwiches Ethan had made that morning with bread that was starting to go stale and cheese that was probably too old but still tasted fine. Lena ate hers without complaint, sitting on a saw bench with her back against the unfinished wall. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Depends on the question." "Why'd you really take this job? And don't tell me it's just the money. There are easier ways to make a living." Ethan chewed slowly, considering how much truth he wanted to share. "I told you, I needed isolation to think." "Think about what?" "About who I was before I became a father. About whether that person was worth finding again, or if I needed to build someone completely new." He finished his sandwich and crumpled the wrapper. "My ex-wife used to say I ran away from problems instead of facing them. She was right. I'd take jobs in remote places, tell myself it was about providing, when really it was about not having to deal with the hard conversations." "Is that what you're doing now? Running away?" "No." The answer came quick and certain. "Now I'm running toward something. There's a difference. I'm out here because being alone helps me see clearly, helps me separate what I want from what other people expect. When I'm done with this job, I'll go back to my son knowing exactly who I am and what I can offer him. Not promises, just truth." Lena was quiet for a long moment. "I've never known who I am without my family name attached. Everything I've done, every job, every relationship, it's all been filtered through being a Hawthorne. Even this exile is about them, about teaching me to appreciate what they built." She looked down at her hands still red from work. "I'm 26 years old, and I've never just been Lena. I don't even know what that looks like." "Maybe that's the real lesson," Ethan said. "Not gratitude, just identity. And if I don't like what I find, then you build something different, same as anyone else." She absorbed that, and Ethan could see her wrestling with it. The idea that she had agency beyond her family's expectations, that the cage might have always been partly unlocked and she'd just never tried the door. It was the kind of realization that couldn't be forced, only discovered, and he knew better than to push. They worked through the afternoon in comfortable silence, Lena learning the rhythm of construction. Measure twice, cut once, check square, fasten, secure. The wall took shape board by board, and by the time the light started to fail, they had the frame complete and half the exterior sheathing in place. Ethan stepped back to inspect their work, checking for gaps and misalignments. It was solid, not perfect, but solid, which was all that mattered in a restoration. Lena stood beside him, wiping sawdust from her face, and he caught her looking at the wall with something like pride. "It's not finished," he said, "but it's real." She touched one of the studs they'd installed. "This morning, it was just lumber in a truck. Now it's part of a wall. We did that." "We did." "It feels different than other accomplishments." "How so?" She struggled for words. "Like it matters in a way that quarterly earnings or successful pitches never did. Like if we'd failed, something tangible would be missing instead of just numbers in a report." Ethan understood. That's the difference between moving money and moving matter. One's abstract, the other's real in ways you can touch. They cleaned up the work site as the temperature dropped and the sky went from blue to purple to black. Ethan fired up the generator for evening power, checked the propane levels, made sure the camp stove had enough fuel for cooking. Lena helped without being asked, learning the shutdown routine the way she'd learned everything else, by watching, asking questions when necessary, and trying not to make the same mistake twice. Dinner was canned stew heated on the stove, eaten while sitting on the floor near the propane heater because the rest of the cabin was too cold for comfort. The generator hummed in the background, and outside the temperature had dropped below 10 degrees, turning the world into something hostile and absolute. "Marcus will report back to my father tonight," Lena said, breaking the silence. "By morning, the whole executive board will know I'm living in what they'll describe as primitive conditions and showing signs of adjustment to reduce circumstances. You worried about what they'll think?" "I'm worried they'll think it's working. That breaking me down was the right move." She set her empty bowl aside. "I don't want to give them the satisfaction." "Then don't think of it as breaking down. Think of it as building different." "Is that what you're doing?" Ethan considered. "Yeah. I spent years thinking I had to be someone impressive to be a good father, someone successful and stable and together. Turns out kids don't need impressive. They need present. They need honest." He met her eyes across the dim space. "I'm building the version of myself that can look my son in the face and tell him the truth about who I am without being ashamed." "What's the truth?" "That I'm flawed, that I make mistakes, that I don't have all the answers." He paused. "But that I'll keep showing up anyway, doing the work, trying to be better. That's all I've got. And maybe it's enough." Lena pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. In the heater's glow, she looked impossibly young, and Ethan was reminded that for all her privilege and polish, she was still just someone trying to figure out how to be human in a world that kept changing the rules. "I used to think strength meant never needing help," she said quietly. "My father runs his empire like that. Total self-sufficiency, no vulnerabilities, control every variable. He taught me that dependence was weakness. What do you think now?" "I think I've asked you for help 4 times in 3 days, and it hasn't made me weaker. It's made me capable of things I couldn't do alone." She looked at him. "So maybe the lesson isn't about self-sufficiency. Maybe it's about knowing when to stand alone and when to build something with others." Ethan smiled. "That's wiser than most people figure out in a lifetime. Don't give me too much credit. I'm still figuring out how to wash dishes without wasting water." "You'll get there." They sat in silence while the generator chugged and the cold pressed against every wall and window. Somewhere in the darkness outside, an animal moved through the snow, deer or elk probably, searching for food in a landscape that offered none easily. The sound was lonely and persistent, and it reminded Ethan of why he'd come here in the first place. To remember that survival was work, that comfort was earned, that everything worth having required sacrifice, and the only question was whether the sacrifice built something or just burned time. "Storm's coming Wednesday," he said eventually. "Big one, according to the forecast. We need the exterior sealed and the interior spaces secure before it hits. What happens if we don't finish in time? Then we spend 3 days freezing while wind tears through gaps we could have closed." He stood and stretched, joints popping. "But we'll finish. Always do." Lena stood too, gathering their bowls. "You have a lot of faith in our work ethic." "I have faith in consequences. They're a hell of a motivator." She laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her, and the sound filled the cold space with something almost like warmth. For just a moment, the cabin felt less like a prison and more like a shelter they were building together, and Ethan thought maybe this whole strange situation might actually lead somewhere worth going. Then the well pump made a sound like grinding metal, and the water pressure dropped to nothing, and he remembered that mountains didn't care about moments of connection or lessons learned. They only cared about whether you were prepared for the next thing that broke. "Get the flashlights," Ethan said, already moving toward his tools. "We've got work to do." And Lena, without hesitation, went to find the lights. Part 3. Louis. Viet 6,000 sexy 500 to Linket Lienmak Voikik Fun Truk Chunko Trien Pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại.
Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lần man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Louis trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nhảy sang document 13 Bonnetin, part VRA. The grinding sound turned out to be a loose coupling in the pressure tank, not the bearing failure Ethan had feared. They fixed it in 40 minutes, working by flashlight in the well house, while their breath turned to fog and their fingers went numb. By the time they stumbled back to the cabin, it was past midnight, and exhaustion had settled into both of them like a physical weight. Lena fell asleep in her room, still wearing her work clothes, too tired to even pull out the sleeping bag properly.
Ethan heard her moving around for a few minutes, then silence, and he knew she'd simply collapsed where she stood. He considered checking on her, decided against it, and instead laid out his own sleeping bag near the propane heater, listening to the wind and thinking about the storm that was coming. Wednesday. 2 days to seal the exterior and secure everything that could blow away or freeze solid. 2 days to turn a construction site into something that could withstand sustained winds and sub-zero temperatures and the kind of snow that buried landmarks and made navigation impossible. He'd done it before, but never with someone else depending on him getting it right. Sleep came slowly, broken by dreams of his son standing in snowdrifts calling his name. And when Ethan woke at 5:30 Tuesday morning, he felt like he'd been running all night. The next 2 days became a blur of relentless work. They started before sunrise and worked past dark, racing against a deadline set by atmospheric pressure and dropping temperatures. Ethan moved through the tasks with mechanical efficiency, sheathing the exterior walls, sealing gaps with spray foam, installing vapor barriers, reinforcing the roof sections where snow load would be heaviest. Lena worked beside him, learning to read a level and swing a hammer and understand why every detail mattered when the weather turned hostile. Tuesday afternoon, they were on the roof securing loose shingles when the wind shifted. Ethan felt it before he saw it, a change in pressure, a smell like ozone and distance, the way the air suddenly felt thinner and colder against exposed skin. He looked north and saw the cloud bank building on the horizon, dark and massive, spreading across the sky like an ink stain. "We need to move faster," he said, hammering another shingle into place. Lena followed his gaze and went pale. "That's the storm? That's the leading edge. Main system won't hit until tomorrow night, but this is the warning." He worked his way toward the ladder. "We've got maybe 18 hours to finish everything critical." They climbed down and went back to work with renewed urgency. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in an hour, then another 5, and the wind picked up until it was a constant presence, pushing against them every time they stepped outside. By evening, it was howling around the cabin corners like something alive and angry, testing every weakness, finding every gap. Ethan fired up the generator and set up work lights so they could continue after dark. They sealed the last section of exterior wall at 9 o'clock, working in circles of harsh LED light, while moths that shouldn't have been alive in January battered themselves against the bulbs. Lena's hands were shaking from cold and fatigue, but she kept driving screws, kept holding board steady, kept asking what needed to happen next. "We're done outside," Ethan said finally, stepping back to survey their work. "Everything else happens inside, or it doesn't happen." They stumbled into the cabin and Ethan immediately started a new checklist. Secure loose items. Move anything critical away from windows. Fill every available container with water in case the pipes froze despite the heat tape. Charge all batteries. Test the backup generator. Inventory food and fuel. Lena helped with the water, filling jugs and pots and even empty paint buckets, creating a reservoir that would last them a week if necessary. Her movements were automatic now, driven by exhaustion and muscle memory, and Ethan recognized the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd pushed past their limits and found a second wind made entirely of stubbornness. "Go sleep," he said around 11. "I'll finish the generator check." "What if you need help?" "Then I'll wake you. Right now I need you rested more than I need another pair of hands." She nodded and disappeared into her room. and this time Ethan heard her actually set up the sleeping bag properly before the sounds of movement stopped. He allowed himself a small smile. She was learning, adapting, becoming competent in ways that mattered, then turned his attention back to the generator. The machine was old, temperamental, and absolutely critical. Without it, they had no lights, no power tools, no way to charge phones or run the well pump if the main power failed. Ethan had rebuilt it once already this winter, replacing the carburetor and cleaning the fuel system. But mechanical things always failed at the worst possible moment. He checked the oil level. Good. Fuel filter. Clean. Spark plug. Slightly fouled, but functional. He ran it through 3 start cycles, listening to the engine's rhythm, feeling for the hesitation that would indicate a problem developing. It ran rough, but steady. Good enough. Probably. Maybe. Ethan shut it down and sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of how tired he was. His shoulders ached from hours of overhead work. His hands were covered in small cuts and scrapes that he didn't remember getting, and his eyes felt like someone had rubbed them with sandpaper. But the cabin was sealed. The water was stored. The generator was functional. They were as ready as they were going to be. He set his phone alarm for 6 and crawled into his sleeping bag without bothering to undress. Sleep took him under like a riptide, fast and complete, and for a few hours there were no dreams at all. Wednesday morning arrived with deceptive calm. The sky was overcast, but not yet threatening. The wind had died to an occasional gust, and the temperature had actually risen a few degrees overnight. Ethan knew better than to trust it. This was the eye before the hurricane, the moment when nature gathered itself for the real assault. He made coffee and checked the weather report on his phone during the brief window when he could get signal. The forecast had worsened. The storm system had intensified overnight, pulling moisture from the Pacific and Arctic air from the north, creating conditions the meteorologists described as historic and potentially catastrophic for anyone caught unprepared at elevation. Expected snowfall, 18 to 30 inches. Wind gusts, up to 70 miles per hour. Temperature dropping to 15 below zero once the front passed. Duration, 36 to 48 hours. Ethan read it twice, then put the phone away and stared at the cabin walls they'd just finished sealing. 30 inches of snow. 70-mile-per-hour winds, 15 below zero. They were about to find out if all their work had been enough. Lena emerged from her room looking hollow-eyed but alert. "I heard you moving around. What's the verdict?" "Bad." He handed her a cup of coffee. "Worse than the original forecast. We're going to be locked in here for at least 2 days, maybe 3 if the roads don't get cleared quickly." She absorbed this while sipping coffee, and Ethan watched her face for signs of panic. There were none. Just calculation, like she was running scenarios in her head. "What do we need to do?" she asked. "Bring in extra firewood from the stack outside. Fill the bathtub." He caught himself. Fill more containers with water. Move the camp stove away from exterior walls in case we lose the propane line. Set up the chemical toilet in your room so we don't have to go outside. Make sure we know where every flashlight and candle is located. "When does it start?" "Couple hours, maybe. We'll know when the wind shifts." They worked through the morning with quiet efficiency, no wasted motion, no unnecessary conversation. Ethan brought in enough firewood to last a week, stacking it against the interior wall where it would stay dry. Lena organized their food supplies, creating a system where everything was accessible without having to search. They moved Ethan's sleeping bag into the main room near the heater, abandoning the pretense that they'd maintain separate spaces once the storm hit. Around noon, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were small at first, almost delicate, drifting down through air that had gone perfectly still. Ethan stood at the window watching them accumulate, and within 20 minutes the delicate fall had become a steady curtain of white, and within an hour the world outside had disappeared into a wall of wind-driven snow that made visibility drop to nothing. The storm had arrived. It came with a sound like freight trains, wind hammering the cabin from every direction at once, finding weak points and exploiting them with mechanical precision. The new walls they'd built held firm, but the older sections groaned and flexed, and Ethan could hear the roof protesting under the accumulated weight of snow that fell faster than it could slide off. By 2 o'clock, the power went out. Ethan had the generator running within 5 minutes, the familiar cough and roar a small comfort against the larger chaos outside. But generators needed fuel, and fuel was finite, and they had maybe 40 hours of runtime if they were careful with power usage. "We only use lights when necessary," he told Lena, raising his voice over the wind. "No space heaters except the propane unit. Keep phones charged, but don't waste battery on entertainment. We're conserving everything until this passes." She nodded, already pulling on extra layers as the temperature inside began to drop. Without the sun, and with wind sucking heat through every microscopic gap, the cabin was losing the battle against the cold. The propane heater glowed in the center of the room, creating a bubble of warmth that extended maybe 6 feet in any direction. But beyond that, the air turned frigid fast. They spent the afternoon huddled near the heater, reading by lantern light, speaking occasionally but mostly just existing in the strange, compressed intimacy that storms created. Outside, the world was violence and chaos. Inside was fragile warmth and the knowledge that only a few inches of wood and insulation stood between them and death. Around 5 o'clock, the generator coughed. Ethan's head snapped up. He listened through the wind, waiting for the sound to repeat. There, another cough. A momentary stumble in the rhythm, then recovery. Something was wrong. "Stay here," he said, already pulling on his coat. "You can't go out in that." Lena grabbed his arm. "The wind! The generator's in the shed 15 feet from the door. If it dies, we lose everything." He zipped the coat and pulled on a face mask. "I'll be back in 5 minutes." "Ethan?" But he was already moving, opening the door against the wind's resistance, stepping out into the storm. The cold was instant and absolute, slamming into him like a physical force. The wind tried to tear the door from his grip, and snow stung his exposed eyes, and visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. Ethan kept one hand on the cabin wall and moved toward the generator shed by memory and feel, counting steps, trusting his sense of direction because he had no choice. The shed door was frozen shut. He kicked it twice before it gave way. And inside the generator was running but smoking, black exhaust pouring from the muffler in a way that meant the fuel mixture was wrong, or the air filter was clogged, or something critical had shifted. Ethan killed the engine and immediately the world went darker, the work lights dying, leaving only the gray dimness of stormlight filtering through cracks. He pulled out his flashlight and inspected the generator by its beam, his fingers already going numb despite the gloves. The air filter housing was coated in ice. The cold had caused condensation that had frozen, blocking airflow, choking the engine. Ethan cleared it with stiff fingers, working fast because every second out here was dangerous. And then he checked the fuel line and found ice there too, crystals forming in the filter. He had spare filters in his tool bag. In the cabin. 15 feet away, but might as well be miles. Ethan made the decision in 5 seconds. He couldn't run the generator like this. It would seize or overheat or fail in some catastrophic way. But he couldn't leave it off either, because without power the well pump was useless, and the lights were dead, and they'd be trapped in the dark with temperatures dropping. He had to fix it. Now, in the middle of the storm. He sprinted back to the cabin, snow immediately filling his tracks behind him. Lena met him at the door, eyes wide. "Fuel filters frozen," he gasped, shaking snow from his coat. "I need the spare filters and the wrench set and the heat gun. Heat gun needs power. We'll run it off the truck battery. Come on." They grabbed supplies and ran back out together, Lena carrying the tools while Ethan used his body to shield her from the worst of the wind. In the shed, he rigged the heat gun to the truck battery with jumper cables while Lena held the flashlight steady, and together they thawed the fuel line enough to remove the frozen filter. Installing the new one should have taken 2 minutes. It took 10 because his fingers wouldn't cooperate, and the threads kept cross-threading and the wind kept finding ways into the shed, bringing snow that melted on the generator's hot parts and created new problems. Finally, the new filter was in place and tightened properly. Ethan primed the fuel system, checked the choke, and pulled the starter cord. Nothing. He pulled again. Nothing. "Come on," he muttered, checking connections. Everything looked right. The fuel was flowing. The air filter was clear. Why wasn't it? The spark plug. He'd noted it was fouled yesterday but hadn't replaced it. I need the spare plug from my tool belt, he said. It's in the inside pocket. Lena dug through the belt and found it, a small piece of ceramic and metal that suddenly represented the difference between survival and crisis. Ethan changed it out with frozen fingers, dropping the wrench twice, cursing under his breath. Then he pulled the starter cord again. The generator caught, coughed, caught again, and roared to life. The work lights blazed back on, and Ethan wanted to collapse with relief, but instead focused on adjusting the choke until the engine ran smooth and steady. Okay, he said, breathing hard. We're good. Let's get back inside. They made it 3 steps from the shed when Lena went down. She'd stepped on ice hidden under the snow, and her feet went out from under her, and she hit the ground hard enough that Ethan heard the impact even over the wind. He dropped to his knees beside her, hands on her shoulders. You hurt? My ankle. Her voice was tight with pain. Twisted it. Ethan didn't hesitate. He got an arm under her shoulders and another under her knees and lifted, carrying her toward the cabin while she protested that she could walk. But walking meant putting weight on the injury, and a sprain at the beginning of a 3-day storm was how small problems became disasters. Inside, he set her down near the heater and carefully removed her boot. The ankle was already swelling, and when he pressed gently on the joint, she hissed through her teeth. Probably just a sprain, he said, but we need to ice it and keep it elevated. Ice. In the middle of a blizzard, Lena laughed, but it came out shaky. That's ironic. Snow works fine. Ethan grabbed a plastic bag and went back outside long enough to fill it with clean snow, then wrapped it in a towel and placed it against her ankle. Keep this on for 20 minutes, then off for 20. I'll make a splint to keep it stable. He fashioned one from spare lumber and duct tape, immobilizing her ankle so she couldn't re-injure it by moving wrong. Lena watched him work, and he could see her processing the new reality, that she was now partially immobilized in a cabin during a historic storm, dependent on someone she'd known for less than 2 weeks. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For what? For being another problem you have to solve. Ethan secured the last piece of tape and sat back. You're not a problem. You're a person who got hurt doing necessary work. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now I can't help with anything physical, which means you're handling everything alone. Then you handle the non-physical stuff. Monitor the generator from the window. Keep track of time so I know when to check the fuel. Manage the food and water supplies. There's always work, Lena. It just looks different depending on what you can do. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I can do that. The afternoon bled into evening, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it intensified, the wind reaching sustained speeds that made the cabin shudder and creak like a ship in heavy seas. Snow piled up against the walls in massive drifts, and the temperature outside dropped so fast that Ethan could watch the thermometer fall degree by degree. Inside, they managed. Ethan checked the generator every 2 hours, refueling it in brief sprints through wind that tried to knock him down. Lena kept their water supply organized and heated soup and monitored the propane heater's fuel levels. They worked around her injured ankle, adapting to the limitation without dwelling on it. Around 9 o'clock, Ethan noticed the cabin was getting colder, despite the heater running at full capacity. He checked the propane tank and felt his stomach drop. They were down to a quarter tank, maybe less, and the storm was barely halfway through. We need to reduce heat usage, he said, doing quick math in his head. If we run the heater all night, we'll be out of propane by morning. Then we're relying entirely on whatever body heat we can generate. Lena pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. What do you suggest? We set up in the smallest space possible to conserve warmth. Probably your room. It's got the door and only one exterior wall. He started gathering blankets. We'll run the heater for 2 hours, get the space warm, then shut it off and rely on insulation and body heat for as long as we can stand it. When it gets unbearable, we turn it back on briefly and repeat. How cold will it get in here? Inside. Probably down to the 30s if we're lucky. 40s if the walls hold heat better than I expect. Lena processed this. And outside? Don't think about outside. They moved into her room, bringing the propane heater, extra blankets, food supplies, water, and flashlights. The space was maybe 10 by 12 feet, with one window that Ethan covered with spare insulation panels to reduce heat loss. With the door closed and the heater running, the temperature climbed to almost 60 degrees, and for a brief window the storm felt distant and survivable. Ethan set his phone alarm for 2 hours, then leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Beside him, Lena was doing something on her own phone, the screen's glow reflecting off her face. "I have signal," she said suddenly. "Just 1 bar, but it's there. Check the weather update." She did, and Ethan watched her expression change. "It's worse. They're saying this is the strongest winter storm to hit the region in 40 years. Multiple rescues already in progress. Roads closed indefinitely." She looked up. "We're completely cut off." "We knew that was possible." Knowing and experiencing are different things. She set the phone down. "If something goes wrong, if you get hurt, or the cabin fails, or the generator dies, there's no one coming to help us." "That's been true since you arrived. The storm just makes it obvious." Lena pulled her knees to her chest, wincing when the movement jarred her ankle. "How are you so calm about this?" "I'm not calm. I'm focused." Ethan opened his eyes and looked at her. "Panic doesn't fix generators or seal gaps or make food appear, so I focus on what I can control and try not to think about the rest." "Is that what you teach your son? To focus on what he can control?" The question caught him off guard. "I try to, but mostly I just try to show him that you keep going even when things are hard. That's really all I've got to teach, persistence in the face of difficulty." "That's more than most people get." Lena's voice had gone soft. "My father taught me that control was everything, that if you were smart enough and ruthless enough, you could bend any situation to your advantage." She gestured at the storm-wrapped cabin. "Turns out nature doesn't care how smart or ruthless you are." "No," Ethan agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence while the heater hummed and the wind screamed and time compressed into something measured by warmth and darkness. The 2 hours passed, and Ethan shut off the heater like he'd promised, and within 20 minutes the temperature began to drop. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but after an hour the cold had settled in like a living presence, seeping through blankets and sleeping bags and layered clothes. Lena's breath began to fog, and Ethan could feel the chill working into his core despite every layer he wore. "How long do we wait before turning it back on?" Lena asked, teeth chattering. "As long as we can stand it. Fuel's more precious than comfort right now." Another hour crawled by. The temperature in the room dropped into the 40s, then the 30s, and Ethan's hands were shaking too much to hold his book steady. Beside him, Lena had curled into a tight ball inside her sleeping bag, only her face visible, and even in the darkness, he could see she was suffering. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll turn it on for 30 minutes, just enough to take the edge off." He relit the heater, and the warmth was immediate and glorious, spreading through the small space like salvation. They both gravitated toward it unconsciously, holding their hands near the element, breathing in air that didn't hurt. "I never appreciated heat before," Lena said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "It was just always there, background, automatic. Most comfort is like that. You don't notice it until it's gone." The 30 minutes passed too quickly, and when Ethan shut off the heater again, the cold rushed back in like it had been waiting. They repeated the cycle through the night, 2 hours off, 30 minutes on, measuring survival in increments of warmth and endurance. Neither of them really slept, just dozed fitfully between the cold and the worry and the noise of the storm that never stopped. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan smelled smoke. He was instantly awake, every sense alert. Smoke. Not wood smoke from a fireplace, but something chemical and wrong coming from somewhere in the cabin. He grabbed his flashlight and stood, ignoring the protest of joints that had stiffened in the cold. "What is it?" Lena asked, struggling to sit up. "Stay here, don't move." He opened the door and smoke rolled into the room, thick, acrid, the kind that came from burning plastics or wiring. Ethan dropped to his knees where the air was clearer and crawled into the main cabin space, following the smell. The generator. Something was wrong with the generator. He made it to the front door and pulled it open, and smoke poured out into the storm like a living thing. Outside, he could see the shed door hanging open, and through the snow he caught glimpses of something glowing orange. The generator was on fire. Ethan didn't think. He ran through knee-deep snow toward the shed, the cold forgotten, a
adrenaline overriding every survival instinct that screamed at him to stay inside. The generator's housing was melting, fuel dripping onto the floor, and if the fire reached the main fuel tank, the whole shed would explode. He grabbed the fire extinguisher he'd mounted on the wall and emptied it onto the generator, foam covering the flames, choking them out. The fire died reluctantly, leaving behind a smoking ruin that had been their only source of power. Ethan stood there in the storm, breathing hard, staring at the destroyed machine. Without the generator, they had no lights except flashlights and candles. No way to run the well pump, no way to charge phones or power tools or maintain any connection to the outside world. They were truly isolated now. He grabbed the flashlight and inspected the damage in its beam. The generator was completely destroyed. The fuel system melted, the electrical components fused together, the whole thing a total loss. He'd need a new generator, which meant ordering one and waiting for delivery, which meant days or weeks depending on how fast the roads cleared. Something caught his eye. A crack in the fuel line he'd replaced earlier. It had failed, leaked fuel onto the hot engine housing, and ignited. His repair job, done in the storm, had caused this. His fault. His mistake. And now they were paying the price. Ethan walked back to the cabin in a daze, snow filling his tracks, the wind pushing him like it wanted him gone. Inside, Lena was standing in the doorway despite her ankle, leaning on the frame, her face pale in the flashlight's beam. "The generator?" she asked. "Gone. Burned out. My fault. The fuel line failed. Can you fix it?" "Not without parts I don't have." He stripped off his snow-covered coat. "We're on our own now. Flashlights and candles only. No power until the storm clears and I can get to town." Lena absorbed this, and Ethan waited for the panic, the recriminations, the fear that would be entirely justified. Instead, she just nodded. "Then we adapt," she said. "Same as everything else." He stared at her, this woman who 2 weeks ago had arrived expecting comfort and special treatment, now standing on a sprained ankle in a freezing cabin during a catastrophic storm, talking about adaptation like it was simple. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We adapt." They went back into the small room and closed the door, and in the darkness lit only by a single candle, they huddled together for warmth because there was no other choice. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to their struggle, and Ethan thought about his son and wondered if this was the lesson he'd come here to learn. That strength wasn't about controlling every variable. It was about enduring when control was gone. Part 4. Louis Viet Saxomin means to liên kết, liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, phá hối thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mọi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document 1353, part 4. The hours that followed blurred into a test of pure endurance. Without the generator, the cabin temperature dropped steadily toward whatever equilibrium existed between their body heat and the storm outside.
Ethan and Lena huddled together in the sleeping bags, sharing warmth because dignity and personal space were luxuries they could no longer afford. The propane heater sat cold and useless, its fuel too precious to burn through in one night. Ethan kept checking his watch by flashlight, marking time, calculating how many hours until dawn, even though dawn wouldn't change anything. The storm was supposed to last another full day, maybe longer, and every hour they burned through their reserves, fuel, food, water, strength, brought them closer to the edge where survival became uncertain. Around 5 in the morning, he noticed Lana was shaking. Not the normal shivering that came from cold, but deeper tremors that rattled through her whole body. Her breathing had gone shallow and rapid, and when he touched her forehead, her skin felt cold and clammy. "Lena," he shook her gently. "Talk to me." Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused. "I'm okay. Just cold." "You're going into hypothermia." Ethan made the assessment clinically, pushing down the fear. We need to get your core temperature up now. He pulled her closer, wrapping both sleeping bags around them, creating a cocoon of shared heat. Her body was ice against his, stealing warmth faster than he could generate it, and he realized she'd been suffering in silence for hours, not wanting to complain, not wanting to be a burden. Why didn't you say something? He demanded, rubbing her arms to stimulate circulation. Didn't want to waste the propane. Her words came slow. You said fuel was precious. You're more precious than fuel. The words came out harsh because fear made him angry. I can get more propane. I can't replace you. Lena's eyes focused on him, and something passed between them in the darkness. Recognition, maybe? Or just the raw honesty that came when pretenses were stripped away by necessity. She nodded slightly and let him work, bringing her back from the edge 1 degree at a time. Ethan made the decision then. They needed heat, needed it now, and rationing didn't matter if she died from cold in the next 2 hours. He lit the propane heater. The warmth spread through the small room like a miracle, and Lena stopped shaking within minutes. Color came back to her face, and her breathing steadied, and Ethan watched the danger pass while his own heart hammered in his chest. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me. Just stay alive. He kept the heater running for an hour, letting the temperature climb to almost 50 degrees, building up a reservoir of warmth they could draw on through the next cold cycle. Lena fell asleep against his shoulder, exhausted beyond the ability to stay conscious, and Ethan sat there holding her while dawn crept into the eastern sky and the storm continued its assault. When he finally shut off the heater, he knew they'd burned through most of their remaining propane. Maybe 6 hours left, maybe 8 if they were lucky. After that, they'd be completely dependent on body heat and whatever insulation the cabin provided. It would have to be enough. The day passed in a strange, suspended state where time felt both slow and fast simultaneously. The storm didn't weaken. If anything, it seemed to gain strength, the wind reaching speeds that made the cabin groan and flex like something alive. Snow piled up against the north wall until it covered the lower windows completely, and the weight on the roof became something Ethan could actually feel through the building's structure. He spent the morning moving through the cabin by flashlight, checking for weaknesses, shoring up sections that seemed to be taking too much stress. His hands were clumsy from cold, his breath visible even inside, and every movement required conscious effort against the fatigue that had settled into his bones. Lena stayed in the small room, keeping her ankle elevated, managing their dwindling supplies with meticulous attention. She'd created an inventory system using a notepad, tracking every can of food, every gallon of water, calculating how long they could last if the storm didn't break soon. We have 4 days of food at current consumption, she reported when Ethan came back from his inspection. Maybe 6 if we cut portions. The storm will break before then. He said it with more confidence than he felt. Storms like this burn themselves out. Another day, maybe 2, and it'll pass. And if it doesn't? Then we make the food last 6 days and figure out day 7 when it comes. She accepted this without argument, and Ethan was struck again by how much she'd changed. The woman who'd arrived expecting comfort and answers now dealt in contingencies and worst-case scenarios without flinching. Around noon, Ethan heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A crack. Sharp and loud enough to cut through the wind, coming from somewhere above them. He grabbed his flashlight and ran to the main room, shining the beam up at the ceiling. There. A fracture in one of the main support beams, running 6 inches along the grain. The snow load had finally exceeded what the old wood could bear, and the beam was beginning to fail. If it broke completely, the entire roof section would collapse. Ethan's mind raced through options. He could try to shore up the beam from below, create temporary support until the snow cleared, but that required lumber he didn't have and time he couldn't spare because the crack was growing. He could actually see it spreading while he watched, millimeter by millimeter, stress concentrating at the weak point. The roof was going to fail. Not today maybe, but soon. And when it did, tons of snow would come crashing down into the cabin, destroying everything, possibly killing them if they were in the wrong place. He ran back to Lena. We need to move, now. What's wrong? Support beam's cracking. The roof's about to come down. He started gathering their essential supplies, sleeping bags, food, water, first aid kit. We're relocating to the truck. Lena went pale. The truck? In this storm? The cab's solid, insulated, and if the roof collapses, it won't be underneath. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight. It's not ideal, but it's better than being crushed. They made their way through the cabin, Ethan carrying most of the supplies while Lena hobbled on her injured ankle. Outside, the storm hit them like a physical attack, wind so strong it actually lifted Lena off her feet for a moment before Ethan grabbed her. The distance to the truck was maybe 40 feet, but in the whiteout conditions it might as well have been miles. Ethan kept one hand on Lena and the other on the wall, following the cabin's edge until they reached the corner, then striking out across open ground toward where he knew the truck was parked. Snow had drifted up past his knees in places, and the wind tried to push them off course, but he kept moving, counting steps, trusting his sense of direction. His hand hit metal. The truck's bed. Relief flooded through him. He got Lena into the passenger seat, then loaded their supplies into the extended cab's back seat. The truck had a half tank of gas, which meant they could run the engine for heat in short bursts, and the cab was tight enough that their body heat would actually make a difference. It wasn't comfortable, but it would keep them alive. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut against the wind. Inside was dark and cramped and cold, but quiet. The storm's roar muffled to something almost bearable. He started the engine and let it run for 10 minutes, the heater blasting warm air into the cab until the temperature climbed above freezing. Then he shut it off to conserve fuel. Lena was shaking again, but this time from fear rather than cold.
Is the roof really going to collapse? Probably. Maybe not today, but soon. Ethan pulled out a sleeping bag and arranged it around her. The beam was old wood under too much stress. I should have reinforced it weeks ago. You didn't know this storm was coming. I knew winter was coming. I knew snow loads were possible. I should have prepared better. His hands clenched on the steering wheel. I got complacent, thought I had everything under control, and now we're sitting in a truck in the middle of a blizzard because I failed to plan for the worst. Lena was quiet for a moment. You know what I've learned in the past 2 weeks? What? That control is an illusion. You can prepare and plan and do everything right, and nature will still find ways to surprise you. The generator failed. The roof is failing. None of that is because you weren't good enough. It's because this mountain is bigger than both of us. Ethan turned to look at her in the dim light. When did you get so wise? I've had a good teacher. She smiled slightly. Someone who shows up every day and does the work even when it's hard, even when things go wrong. That's not failure, Ethan. That's persistence. The words settled into him, and something tight in his chest loosened slightly. He'd been carrying the weight of every mistake, every miscalculation, every moment where he'd come up short, and Lena was right. He'd been measuring himself against impossible standards instead of acknowledging that some things were simply beyond control. They sat in silence while the storm shook the truck and snow accumulated on the windshield until they couldn't see out at all. The world contracted to the small space of the cab, warm enough to survive but cold enough to remind them constantly of how fragile their shelter was. Hours passed. Ethan ran the engine every 90 minutes for 10 minutes at a time, creating a cycle that would stretch their fuel for days if necessary. They ate cold soup from cans and drank water that had started to freeze around the edges. Conversation came in short bursts between long silences, both of them too tired to maintain extended discussion. Around 6 in the evening, Lena's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, surprised. I have service. Barely, but it's there. Check the weather. She did, and Ethan watched her face change as she read. The storm is breaking. They're predicting it'll be over by midnight, clearing tomorrow morning. She looked up. We made it. Relief hit him so hard he had to close his eyes. They'd made it. Through the worst storm in 40 years, through equipment failures and injuries and near hypothermia, they'd survived. There's something else, Lena said, her voice changing. Emails from my father's legal team. Lots of them. About what? She scrolled through them, her expression unreadable. They want me to come home early. They're saying the storm proves the cabin is unsafe, that forcing me to stay violates duty of care. They've sent documentation for me to sign acknowledging the hazardous conditions. Are you going to sign it?
Lena stared at the phone for a long moment, then closed it and set it aside. No? Why not? This is your way out. You can leave tomorrow, go back to your life, tell them you completed the lesson or whatever narrative they want. Because I'm not done yet. She turned to face him. I came here angry and entitled and convinced I was being punished for crimes I didn't commit. And maybe I was. But somewhere in the past 2 weeks, I stopped caring about proving my family wrong and started caring about proving something to myself. What's that? That I'm capable of more than pushing money around and attending meetings. That I can actually build something real with my own hands. That I don't need my family's approval to have value. She gestured at the storm-wrapped truck. I survived this, we survived this, and I'm not ready to go back to a world where none of that matters. Ethan understood. He'd come to this mountain for the same reason, to find out who he was without the labels other people put on him, to test himself against something that didn't care about his past failures or future promises. How long do you want to stay? He asked. As long as it takes to figure out what comes next. Lena pulled the sleeping bag tighter. I have access to my laptop. Before the storm hit, I'd been going through my family's corporate documents, looking for inconsistencies in how they structured the business. I found things, questionable things, contracts that don't add up, partnerships that seem designed to hide money rather than make it. You're investigating your own family. I'm investigating a company that put me in charge of a division and then stripped my authority the moment I started asking hard questions. Her voice had gone hard. They wanted me to learn humility. Instead, I learned to look closer at what they were hiding. That's dangerous. So is staying silent. She met his eyes. My father dumped me here to break me, to make me grateful for the privilege of being a hawthorn. But what he actually did was give me time and distance to see the whole structure clearly. And from here, it looks corrupt. Ethan processed this. What are you planning to do with what you found? I don't know yet, but I'm not going back until I have answers, until I have leverage. She smiled grimly. They taught me everything they know about power and manipulation. Time to use those lessons against them. The truck shuddered as a gust hit it, and snow cascaded off the roof in a small avalanche. Outside, the storm was still raging, but Ethan could feel it weakening. The wind not quite as violent, the cold not quite as sharp. They were through the worst of it. He thought about Lena's words, about using the tools your opponents gave you, about turning exile into education. It was smart, ruthless. Exactly the kind of thinking that built empires and destroyed them. You'll need help, he said finally. If you're going after your family's company, you'll need people who understand construction law, environmental regulations, labor practices, all the places where corners get cut and money gets hidden. You know people like that? I know contractors who've been screwed by developers. I know inspectors who've been pressured to approve unsafe work. I know where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. He turned in his seat to face her. If you're serious about this, I can help you build a case. But you need to be sure, because once you start down this path, there's no going back to being Daddy's daughter. Lena didn't hesitate. I'm sure. They shook hands in the dim cab, and Ethan felt the calluses on her palms. New skin, formed from work and hardship, physical proof of her transformation. This wasn't the woman who'd arrived 2 weeks ago. This was someone new, forged in cold and struggle, and the kind of honesty that only came when everything else was stripped away. The storm broke around 11 that night, the wind dying to whispers, the snow tapering to nothing. By midnight, stars were visible through breaks in the clouds, and the temperature began to rise as the Arctic air mass moved on. They stayed in the truck until dawn, sleeping fitfully, waiting for enough light to assess the damage. When the sun finally came up, Ethan climbed out into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted higher than the truck's hood in places, creating sculpted walls that turned the familiar area into something alien and beautiful. The cabin was still standing, but barely. The north section had indeed collapsed. The roof caved in under the weight, timbers jutting at broken angles like ribs. But the section they'd been working on, the new walls they'd built together, stood firm. Ethan walked around the cabin slowly, checking the damage, calculating what could be salvaged and what was lost. It was bad. Weeks of setback, maybe months. Insurance would cover some of it, But not the lost time, not the momentum. Lena appeared beside him, limping on her ankle but mobile. She stared at the collapsed section without speaking, and Ethan waited for disappointment or recrimination. Instead, she said, "We can rebuild it. It'll take time." "We have time." She pointed at the section that had survived. "And we already proved we can work together. This is just more of the same." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. Somewhere in the past 72 hours, they'd stopped being a contractor and an exile forced together by circumstances. They'd become something else. Partners, maybe? Or just two people who understood what it took to survive and were willing to do the work. "All right," he said, "we rebuild. But first we need to get you to a doctor for that ankle, and I need to get a new generator, and we both need to sleep in actual beds for about 12 hours. Deal." Lena smiled, and it was genuine. "And then we come back and fix this place properly. Together." They trudged back to the truck and Ethan started the engine, letting it warm up while he cleared snow from the windows. The road down the mountain would be treacherous, probably impassable in places, but the storm had broken and help was coming. They'd made it through the worst. Before he put the truck in gear, Lena pulled out her phone and opened her email. She typed for a few minutes, then showed him the screen. It was a message to her father's legal team, formal and precise. In it, she declined to sign any documentation regarding unsafe conditions. She confirmed her intention to complete the full 60-day residency as agreed, and she requested copies of all corporate partnership agreements related to the Hawthorne Holdings real estate division, citing her board position and right to audit company records. "That's going to start a war," Ethan said. "Good." Lena hit send. "They wanted to teach me a lesson about power. Time to show them I was paying attention." Ethan put the truck in gear and started down the mountain, and despite the exhaustion and the damage and the uncertain future, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind that came from wishing things were different, but the solid kind that came from knowing you could handle whatever came next. He'd survived the storm. He'd kept Lena alive. He'd done the work even when it seemed impossible. And somewhere down in Ridgemont, his son was waiting for a father who could finally look him in the eye and say the truth. That life was hard, and work was necessary, and sometimes you failed, but you kept going anyway. That was the lesson. Not humility or gratitude or any of the other abstract concepts Lena's family had tried to impose. Just persistence, just showing up, just doing the work. Everything else was just weather. They made it to town by noon, and the first thing Ethan did was call his ex-wife to tell her he was okay, that the storm had been bad but he'd survived, that he'd be home to see Ryan as soon as the roads cleared completely. Her relief came through the phone line, and he realized how much worry he'd caused by being unreachable for 3 days. "I love you," he told his son when he got on the line. "And I'm coming home soon, I promise." "When, Dad?" 2 more weeks, maybe 3. I have some work to finish, and then I'm done. And when I come back, I'll have enough saved for us to have our own place, just you and me." "Really?" "Really." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I'm building something good, Ryan, for both of us, and I can't wait to show you." When he hung up, Lena was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. Just thinking about what it must be like to have someone waiting for you like that. Someone who loves you without conditions. You'll find it when you're ready." "Maybe." She looked out at the snow-covered town, small and quiet in the winter light. "Or maybe I'll build it myself, same as everything else." They got rooms at the local motel, slept for 14 hours straight, and woke up to news that the main highway would be clear by evening. Ethan spent the day ordering a new generator and replacement materials for the cabin, while Lena worked on her laptop, compiling documentation, building her case against her family one spreadsheet at a time. That night, over dinner at the town's only restaurant, she showed him what she'd found. Partnership agreements with shell companies, environmental violations that had been covered up with payoffs, labor law violations buried in subsidiary paperwork, contracts structured to avoid taxes through technically legal but ethically bankrupt loopholes. "This is enough to destroy the company," Ethan said, scrolling through the evidence. "If this goes public, your family loses everything." "I know." Lena took the laptop back. "Which is why I'm not going public. Not yet." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to offer them a deal." Her eyes were hard, They release me from all family obligations. They give me controlling interest in the real estate division. They restructure the company to comply with actual environmental and labor standards. And in exchange, I don't burn down everything they've built. They'll never agree to that. They will when they see what I have, when they understand I'm serious. She closed the laptop. My father taught me that power comes from information and leverage. I have both now. And I'm done being the daughter who accepts punishment for asking questions. Ethan raised his coffee cup. To lessons learned the hard way, Lena clinked her cup against his. And to teachers who show up even when it's hard. They drove back up the mountain the next morning, the truck loaded with supplies, ready to face whatever came next. The cabin waited for them, damaged but standing, and Ethan looked at it and saw not failure, but potential. They would rebuild. They would make it stronger. They would prove that sometimes the best response to destruction was simply to begin again. And this time, they wouldn't be doing it alone. Part 5 lưu ý thật. Viết Sarcasm 600 to liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document 13 faces. The work of rebuilding started immediately, but it was different this time. Ethan and Lena approached the damaged cabin not as a contractor and his unwanted charge, but as partners with equal investment in the outcome. They spent the first day just clearing debris, hauling broken timbers and collapsed roofing out into the snow where they could be sorted for salvage or disposal. The new generator hummed steadily in its shed, and the sound was reassuring, proof that setbacks could be overcome with the right parts and enough determination. Lena's ankle was still tender, but she'd wrapped it tight and refused to slow down. She worked alongside Ethan, learning to use a reciprocating saw to cut through damaged studs, understanding load-bearing principles as they reinforced the remaining structure. Her hands were calloused now, her movements efficient, and when she made a mistake, she fixed it without needing praise or permission. 3 days into the rebuild, a black sedan appeared on the mountain road. Ethan saw it first, that familiar expensive gleam that meant someone from Lena's world had come calling. He set down his hammer and walked to meet the vehicle before it could get too close to the worksite, but Lena was already moving past him, her face set in hard lines. The car stopped and a man stepped out. Older, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of tailored suit that cost more than Ethan made in a month. His resemblance to Lena was unmistakable. Same bone structure, same intensity in the eyes, but where Lena had begun to soften around the edges, this man was all sharp angles and controlled power. Douglas Hawthorne surveyed the cabin with barely concealed distaste, then turned his attention to his daughter. "Lena," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "You look different." "I am different." She crossed her arms, not moving closer. "What are you doing here?" "I received your request for corporate documents, along with some very interesting allegations about partnership structures and environmental compliance." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I thought we should have a conversation face to face." "There's nothing to discuss. I have board authority to audit company records. Either you provide them, or I file a formal complaint with the SEC. Douglas glanced at Ethan, dismissing him in a single look, then returned his focus to Lena. "I see your time here has given you a sense of independence. That's good. That was the point. But let's not confuse learning self-reliance with understanding how business actually works." "I understand perfectly." Lena's voice stayed level. "You structured partnerships to hide liabilities. You violated environmental regulations and paid off inspectors. You exploited contract workers and buried the complaints in subsidiary paperwork. I have documentation for all of it. Documentation that would hurt the company you claim to care about." Douglas stepped closer. "Release those files and you destroy thousands of jobs, tank pension funds, and crater property values across 3 states. Is that what you want? To burn it all down out of spite?" "I want you to fix it." Lena didn't back down. restructure the partnerships legitimately, bring environmental compliance up to standard, pay workers fairly, run the company like it's actually accountable to something beyond profit margins. And if I refuse, then I go public with everything and let the courts sort it out. Father and daughter stared at each other, and Ethan could see the calculation running behind Douglas's eyes, weighing his daughter's seriousness, measuring her resolve, trying to find the pressure point that would make her fold. He'd clearly underestimated how much she'd changed. You've been listening to people who don't understand the complexity of running a business at this scale, Douglas said finally, gesturing vaguely at Ethan. Manual labor is admirable, but it doesn't prepare you for corporate strategy. Manual labor taught me something you never did, Lena shot back. That work has consequences. The cutting corners to save money costs someone something real. That every decision affects actual people, not just spreadsheets. She took a step forward. You sent me here to learn humility. I learned accountability instead. Now you get to choose whether you apply those lessons to the company or I do it for you. Douglas was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan saw the exact instant when the man realized he'd lost control of the situation. His daughter wasn't bluffing. She had the documentation, the leverage, and most importantly, she had nothing left to lose because he'd already taken everything away when he exiled her. What specifically do you want? Douglas asked, his tone shifting from paternal to negotiator. Full controlling interest in the real estate division, transferred into my name with no oversight or veto power from the main board. A legally binding commitment to environmental remediation on all properties currently in violation. Fair market wages for all contract workers with benefits and worker protections. And you leave me alone to run things my way. That's not a negotiation, that's a hostile takeover. That's me fixing your mistakes before they destroy everything. Lena's voice softened slightly. I'm not trying to hurt the company, Dad. I'm trying to save it. But I can't do that if you keep prioritizing short-term profit over long-term sustainability. Douglas looked at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her, not the reflection of his own ambitions, but an independent person with her own vision. Ethan watched the man's face work through emotions he couldn't quite hide. Surprise, respect, maybe even a trace of pride buried under the anger. You've become formidable, Douglas said quietly. I've become honest. There's a difference. Is there? He turned and walked a few steps toward the cabin, examining the reconstruction work. You know, when I sent you here, I expected you to break within a week. Call me crying, begging to come home, willing to accept any terms just to escape the cold and isolation. He glanced back at her. Instead, you learned to swing a hammer and developed a spine. I'm not sure whether to be impressed or concerned. Be both. Lena moved to stand beside Ethan, a deliberate choice of positioning. And understand that I'm not the same person you dumped here 6 weeks ago. I've rebuilt walls and wells and my entire understanding of what matters. You can either work with who I've become or fight me and lose. Douglas studied them both, his daughter in work clothes with sawdust in her hair, standing next to a contractor who taught her that value came from effort, not inheritance. The tableau clearly bothered him on some level, this visible proof that his carefully constructed lesson had backfired completely. I'll have my lawyers draw up the transfer documents, he said finally. The real estate division is yours. You run it however you want. But if you fail, if your idealistic approach tanks profitability, you don't come crying to me for a bailout. I won't fail. Lena's confidence was absolute. Because I'm going to run it the way it should have been run from the beginning, with integrity. Integrity doesn't pay dividends. It does when you're building something that lasts. She gestured at the partially rebuilt cabin. This place was falling apart because the previous owner cut corners and used cheap materials. Ethan's rebuilding it properly, with quality lumber and real craftsmanship. It'll cost more up front, but it'll stand for decades. That's how I'm going to run your company. Building things that last instead of quarterly earnings that collapse in the next crisis. Douglas absorbed this, and something flickered across his face that might have been regret. You really have changed. Yeah, I have. He walked back to his car, then paused with his hand on the door. For what it's worth, I am impressed. I don't agree with your methods, and I think you're naive about market realities. But you've proven you're not the spoiled child I thought you were. He climbed into the sedan. Don't make me regret giving you this chance. The car disappeared down the mountain road, leaving Lena and Ethan standing in the snow. She was shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline and the weight of what had just happened. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder. You okay? He asked. I just blackmailed my father into giving me control of a $100 million company division. She laughed, high and slightly hysterical. I have no idea what I'm doing. Yes, you do. You're going to fix the things that are broken and build something worth keeping, same as this cabin. What if I fail? What if he's right and integrity doesn't matter in business? Then you fail knowing you tried to do it right. That counts for something. Ethan turned her to face him. But you won't fail, because you're not doing this alone. Lena met his eyes. What do you mean? I mean, I'm coming with you. When this cabin's done, I'm taking my payment and investing it in your company. I'll be your contractor, your compliance officer, your connection to the people who actually build the buildings you're going to develop. He smiled. You need someone who knows where corners get cut. I need stable work that doesn't take me away from my son for months at a time. We can help each other. You'd really leave this? She gestured at the mountain. After everything you said about needing isolation? I needed isolation to figure out who I wanted to be. I did that. Now I need partnership with someone who shares my values about doing work that matters. He squeezed her shoulder. That's you, Lena. You're building something real. I want to be part of it. She hugged him then, sudden and fierce, and Ethan held her while she processed everything that had just changed. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her smile was genuine. Okay, she said. Partners. For real this time. For real. They went back to work on the cabin with renewed energy, and over the next 3 weeks the structure took shape in ways that exceeded the original plans. Ethan built it properly this time. No shortcuts, no compromises, using everything he'd learned about mountain construction to create something that would withstand whatever weather threw at it. Lena worked alongside him, and in the evening she worked on her laptop, restructuring the real estate division, reaching out to contractors Ethan recommended, building a network of people who prioritize quality over cost-cutting. The legal documents arrived via courier on a Tuesday afternoon. Lena read through them carefully, checking every clause, making sure there were no hidden provisions that would let her father maintain control. When she was satisfied, she signed them on the hood of Ethan's truck, using a piece of plywood as a desk. It's official, she said, sliding the documents back into their envelope. I now own the largest problem in my family's portfolio. You own the largest opportunity, Ethan corrected. Problems are just opportunities you haven't solved yet. She laughed. You sound like a motivational poster. I sound like someone who spent too much time thinking while hammering nails. The cabin was finished on a bright March morning when the snow had started to melt and the first hints of spring were visible in the valley below. Ethan did the final walkthrough alone, checking every joint and seal, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. The place had been transformed, from a failing restoration to a solid, beautiful structure that honored the original while incorporating modern efficiency and safety. He stood in the main room and thought about everything that had happened here, the arguments and the alliance, the storm that had nearly killed them, the lessons learned in cold and hardship about what really mattered when everything else was stripped away. This cabin had been a prison when Lena arrived. Now it was proof that two people working together could build something that lasted. Lena found him standing there, and they looked at the finished work in comfortable silence. It's beautiful, she said finally. It's honest, Ethan replied. That's better than beautiful. What happens to it now? The estate is selling it. Should get a good price given the quality of the restoration. He smiled. My final paycheck is going to be substantial. Enough to put that down payment on a place for me and Ryan, with plenty left over to invest in your company. Our company? Lena corrected. We're partners, remember? Our company. The words felt good. What's the first project? There's a development in Ridgemont that's been stalled for 2 years because of environmental violations. Previous contractor used substandard materials and dumped waste illegally. Lena pulled out her phone and showed him photos of a half-built apartment complex. I'm going to buy it, remediate the environmental damage properly, and finish it using quality materials and fair labor. It'll cost more than the original budget, but it'll be something people can actually live in safely. Ethan studied the photos. That's a year of work, minimum, maybe 18 months. Is that a problem? No. He looked at her. It's perfect, because it means I can work close to home, see my son regularly, and still do meaningful work. That's all I've wanted.
Then we're doing it. Lena put the phone away. We start next month. I've already got a crew lined up, people you recommended who understand we're doing this right, even if it takes longer. They walked out of the cabin together and stood in the driveway looking back at what they'd built. The structure sat solid against the mountain backdrop, windows reflecting the afternoon sun, every line clean and true. I learned something here, Lena said after a while. What's that? That my father was right to send me here, just not for the reasons he thought. He wanted to break me down and rebuild me in his image. Instead, I got broken down and rebuilt myself into something better. She turned to him. Thank you for that. For teaching me that work has dignity, that shortcuts have consequences, that showing up matters more than showing off. You taught me things too, Ethan said. That isolation isn't the same as clarity. That partnership doesn't mean losing independence. That sometimes the people who seem the most different from you are exactly who you need. He held out his hand. Thank you for staying, for doing the work, for becoming someone I'm proud to build things with. They shook hands, then Lena pulled him into another hug, and this time it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. 2 weeks later, Ethan moved into a small house in Ridgemont, 2 bedrooms, a yard for Ryan to play in, close enough to his ex-wife that shared custody actually worked. His son ran through the empty rooms that first day, claiming the smaller bedroom as his own, and Ethan watched him with a fullness in his chest that felt like everything he'd been working toward. This is really ours, Ryan asked, standing in the living room. We don't have to leave? We don't have to leave. Ethan knelt down to his son's level. This is home. For real this time. Because you finished the job on the mountain? Because I finished a lot of things. The cabin, yeah. But also figuring out what kind of dad I want to be, what kind of work matters to me, who I want to build a life with. He ruffled Ryan's hair. I'm not perfect, buddy. I'm going to make mistakes. But I'm here now and I'm staying here. And we're going to build something good together. Ryan hugged him, small arms tight around his neck, and Ethan held his son and thought about the mountain and the storm and the woman who'd arrived angry and left transformed. They'd all been broken down and rebuilt into something better. The next morning, Ethan met Lena at the stalled development site in Ridgemont. She'd brought coffee and blueprints, and they sat in her car going over the plans while construction crews began the work of remediation. The previous contractor had cut so many corners that the entire foundation needed to be redone, but Lena had budgeted for it, planned for it, accepted the cost of doing things right. How long until we can start actual construction? She asked, marking notes on the blueprints. 6 weeks to clear the environmental violations and pour new foundations, then 12 to 14 months to complete the building. Ethan sipped his coffee. We'll be living in hard hats for a while. Good, she smiled. I've gotten used to it. They worked together through that spring and summer, Ethan managing the construction while Lena handled the business side, permits and inspections and negotiating with suppliers who weren't used to clients who actually cared about quality. Word spread that Hawthorne Real Estate Division had new management and new standards, and slowly, carefully, contractors who'd been burned by the old regime started coming back. By fall, the apartment complex had walls and a roof, and Ethan could see the shape of what it would become. Affordable housing built to last, with proper insulation and real craftsmanship, the kind of place where families could actually build lives. Ryan visited the site one Saturday, wearing a child-sized hard hat that Lena had bought him, and Ethan showed his son how buildings went together, how work created value, how showing up every day added up to something permanent. Is Miss Lena your boss? Ryan asked, watching Lena discuss something with the electrical contractor. She's my partner, Ethan said. We work together. Neither of us is the boss. Like a team? Exactly like a team. Ryan considered this. I like her. She doesn't talk to me like I'm little. That's because she respects people who do real work. And you helped me clean up the site earlier, so you're doing real work.
His son beamed, and Ethan felt that fullness again, the sense that everything had finally aligned into something that made sense. He had meaningful work with a partner who shared his values. He had a home where his son could visit and feel stable. He had a future that didn't require choosing between being a good father and being a competent professional. The mountain had taught him that these things weren't in conflict. They just required honest work and the willingness to build carefully rather than quickly. By December, 1 year after Lena had arrived at the mountain cabin, the apartment complex was near completion. They held a walkthrough for the first prospective tenants, and Ethan watched Lena show families through units that were beautiful and functional and built to standards that exceeded code requirements. "Why'd you build it this way?" one woman asked, noting the thick walls and high-quality windows. "Most places at this price point cut corners." "Because corners fail," Lena said simply, "and I want these apartments to be standing 50 years from now, giving shelter to your grandchildren. That requires doing it right the first time." The woman signed a lease that afternoon, and 5 more families followed over the next week. By January, the building was 80% occupied, and the reviews were unanimously positive. People appreciated living in a place that was clearly built with care rather than maximum profit. Lena's father came to see the completed project on a cold February morning. He walked through the building in silence, examining the construction, checking the finishes, running his hand along walls that were solid and true. "You actually did it," he said when they reconvened in the lobby. "You built something profitable and ethical." "I built something that lasts," Lena corrected. "The profit is just a side effect of doing the work right." Douglas looked at his daughter, and Ethan saw something in the older man's expression that might have been pride. "The board wants to extend your approach to other divisions. They've seen the numbers, the tenant satisfaction rates, the media coverage. Turns out integrity is good marketing." "I don't care about marketing," Lena said. "I care about the people living in buildings I develop. If they're happy and safe, everything else follows." "When did you become so principled?" "When you sent me to a mountain and I learned what actually matters." She gestured at Ethan. "I had a good teacher." Douglas extended his hand to Ethan. "Mr. Cole, I owe you an apology. I dismissed you as temporary labor when we first met. That was short-sighted." Ethan shook his hand. "You were protecting your daughter in the only way you knew how. I understand that. Still, you taught her things I couldn't. Thank you for that." After Douglas left, Lena turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "You know what the weirdest part of all this is?" "What?" "I think he's actually proud of me. Maybe for the first time ever, I've done something that impressed him on my terms rather than his." "How does that feel?" "Honestly, good. Not because I need his approval, but because it means he's finally seen me as a real person instead of a reflection of himself." She smiled. "The mountain changed both of us. I just changed in ways he didn't expect." "Good changes?" Ethan asked. "The best kind. The kind that last." Spring came again, and with it the anniversary of Ethan's final day on the mountain cabin. He drove up alone one Saturday, following the road he'd traveled countless times, watching the elevation climb and the temperature drop and the landscape open into those familiar ridges and valleys. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it, solid and beautiful, smoke rising from the chimney because someone had bought it and was using it as intended. He didn't stop, just drove past slowly, remembering the work and the storm and the partnership that had formed in the cold. He'd come to that mountain alone and desperate, looking for answers about who he wanted to be. He'd left with a partner, a purpose, and a clear understanding that strength wasn't about control or isolation. It was about showing up, doing the work, and building something that would outlast your own struggle. When he got back to Ridgemont that evening, Lena was waiting at his house with Ryan, the two of them making dinner in his small kitchen while arguing good-naturedly about whether to add mushrooms to the pasta sauce. "How was the mountain?" Lena asked when he came in. "Still there, still cold, still teaching lessons to anyone willing to listen." "Think you'll go back?" "Maybe someday, but not to hide, just to visit the place where everything changed." They ate dinner together, Ethan and his son and the woman who'd arrived as an exile and become a partner, and talked about the next project, the next building, the next opportunity to prove that doing things right was worth the extra effort. Later, after Ryan had gone to bed and Lena was gathering her things to leave, she paused at the door. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking that cabin job? Everything that came after?" Ethan thought about the question, about the isolation and the hardship and the storm that had nearly killed them, about the mistakes and the setbacks, and the constant struggle against conditions that didn't care about his plans. "No," he said, "because it led here. To work that matters, partnership that works, and a life where I get to see my son grow up while building things that last. That's everything I wanted." "Me too," Lena smiled, "though I probably would have appreciated fewer near-death experiences in the learning process. Where's the character development in that?" She laughed and headed out into the night, and Ethan stood in his doorway watching her go, thinking about how far they'd both come from that first confrontation in the snow. Two people who shouldn't have worked together, forced into partnership by circumstance and desperation, discovering that sometimes the best things you build are the relationships that form while doing the work. The mountain had stripped them down to essentials and taught them what mattered. Everything after was just applying those lessons to the world beyond the ridge. And as Ethan closed his door and walked back to the small house he'd built with honest work and careful planning, he knew with absolute certainty that the lesson had been worth learning. Not the one Lena's father intended, but the one they both needed, the one that would last.